In this video, I will be installing the custom landing lights kits on my Freewing 70mm F-22 Raptor. Now, just like the tail flame lights and navigation lights, the landing lights offer not only a cool additional scale detail, but they also add an air of safety for the operation of the aircraft. In the case of the landing lights specifically, when on approach, they offer an additional easy visual cue as to whether or not the landing gear are out or in, which is important when you're coming in on a hot landing. Let's get to it. To complete this project, I'll need 3 5mm bright white LEDs, a 56 ohm resistor, a remote switching module, some 30 gauge stranded 2-conductor wire, 3 3x5mm cap screws, 3 1x5mm Phillips head screws, an Allen key, solder, a screwdriver, soldering iron, a fishing line, a caliper, a radio for testing,
and a 3D printer loaded with ABS printing filament.
My landing lights are a 2-part design consisting of the light itself and the strut mount that connects the light and holds it to the struts on the airplane. Now, to get started, we need to flip the plane over, take a few measurements, and see what we're working with. Right off the bat, I notice a really good amount of space inside the nose gear wheel well, which should make it really easy for me to mount the light in its preferred location here high at the front of the landing gear strut, just above the moving parts. And secondly, the diameter of 9.2 millimeters will allow me to use the same size landing gear strut mount that I use on my 70mm F-16. The main gear wheel well is an entirely different story. For starters, it's a much tighter fit, which means we have to be a lot more precise with the positioning of the light so as not to interfere with the operation of the mechanism.
And secondly, the diameter of the strut is 11.01 millimeters, meaning we'll need a larger diameter strut mount in order to fit. And the needed location of the light within the wheel well means that we'll have to also redesign the strut mount so that the light can mount in this position here.
Since the lights are mounted on the sides of the main gear struts, that means we need to make a separate left and right strut for the main gear. Now, I'll start with my A10 strut design, which has a similar situation, and where the struts need to mount onto the side, or the lights need to mount onto the sides of the struts. So we'll start here, and we'll save it as a new file, and then we'll get to modifying it to the new sizes.
So the first thing I need to do is select the parts of the strut mount that will not change in size, i.e. the screw holes that mount the light to the strut mount and also mount the strut mount itself to the strut. Once those things are safely out of the way, I can then focus on the points that are going to be changing in size, or the central portion that wraps around the strut itself. So I can do a scale up proportionally to enlarge the entire thing. Then I can go and I can work individually on the side walls so that I can adjust their thickness to about 1.5 millimeters thick, give or take. And the central section, remember, has to be about 11 millimeters. Then I go to the side view and I shrink the height of the overall mount back down to the same height as the other mount, which is about 5 millimeters. Then I do a little bit of cleanup around the edges to kind of make things look a little prettier. And then I switch over into render mode so I can get a look at it with all the shading. Looks great. Now we can flip it to make a left and a right version, since we do have a left and a right version on the airplane. And then I make multiple copies so that I can print multiples at once. In this case, I'm going to print 6. Now we export it and then we send it to the printer.
While the parts are printing, we can return back to the airplane and feed all the wires through. We open up the main compartment and we'll start with the nose gear, and these wires here are fitting up to the nose wheel. So we take our fishing line here and we're going to feed it down through that opening where we should see the end of the fishing line feeding into the front wheel well. And then we take our 30 gauge wire, hook it onto the end of the fishing line like so, and then pull it back through and out into the electronics compartment. Pulling back the slack so that we have just a little bit of overhang to work with, and then cutting it just a little bit short, or about the length of the wheel. And the nose gear is done. Running the wires for the main gear is significantly more challenging than running the wires for the nose gear. In order to do it, the solution that I came up with was to use the wire, the existing wire that powers the aileron and flap servo on each wing, and use that as a fishing line because the channel that it passes through is extremely narrow. But in order to use that as a fishing line, I have to remove the battery plate that's underneath the battery. So let's get that out of the way. Pop those 4 screws out, and then we remove the battery tray like so, and then we find our, here it is, aileron flap wire. Unplug it from the junction box here and here in the receiver, just for good measure. And then this is what we're going to use to pull the other wire through. Take a little bit of good old-fashioned gift wrap tape. We're going to tape the ends of this wire, hopefully securely, to our aileron flap wire, like so. That's pretty secure, but it's not too bulky because we still need to fit it through this narrow channel. Then we're going to move down to the other end of it where it needs to come out at. I'm going to just pull this guy. We're guiding the other end. Pull it through. Making sure not to pull it all the way through, because then that would be bad. And there, the other end. No, it's not. Let's do that again. Pull this guy through, carefully feeding the other end in the compartment, feeding the wire through, making sure it doesn't snag on anything. Carefully pulling it through. And there is the end with our landing gear wires intact. Let that tape loose, obviously being careful not to cut the wires. We can pull our landing gear wire in some more until it reaches down and beyond the wheel. From there, then we secure it while we pull the slack back out of our flap aileron wire so that we don't pull the landing light wire back through. And about there should be good. We give ourselves a little bit of slack on the other end for connections. We reconnect our ailerons and flaps back into the receiver and the junction box. Our flap line there, and our aileron line goes back there. And then we disconnect the line for the left wing and repeat the process. and success. Now the wiring for this project is pretty straightforward. Black wire to black wire to black wire. On the other end, the black wire from the PPM switching module. The end of the 3 wires coming out of the airplane. A little bit of solder on the end of the PPM switching module wire. And then we connect those 2 solder ends to each other. Like so. Positive lead guys get their solder, and then they get attached to the 56 ohm resistor. And that just protects the LEDs from overcurrent coming out of the receiver. Now I don't really have an overcurrent issue with white LEDs, but after all that I go through to get them attached and get them installed, I don't want to take any chances. Cut off that little bit of overhang from the resistor lead. On the other side of the resistor, we solder in our positive wire. And I am by no means a professional solderer, so please be kind to me in the comments. And now we just move on to the other end of the wire and attach our LEDs. The long lead on the LED connects to the positive or red wire. And the short lead connects to the black wire, like so. And then soldering the wires on main gear number 1. And then main gear wires, red to long lead. Black to short lead. Using the back of the razor blade, just kind of tuck these wires into this channel I just created so that the wire goes into the wheel well with the landing gear struts. Liquid electrical tape. The stuff is messy, but I love it. Completely encasing that resistor in this goo. And we give that a few minutes to dry while we go and check on the 3D printer. Looks like I'm just in time. Now that the parts have been successfully printed, it's time to install them. I'll be installing 2 different types of strut mounts. There's the front strut mount, where the light actually mounts to the front of it, and it has a 9mm diameter to clamp onto the nose wheel. And then our newly redesigned and printed side strut mounts, left and right versions that go on the main landing gear, as well as a set of lights themselves. We'll start with the nose gear, and the mount is going to go around the strap like so, and then we're going to take our 3mm cap screw here, and of course we drop the Allen key into the wheel well. And then as we tighten that down, it's pretty snug on the strut, and that's important because for safety purposes, we don't need that thing moving around on the strut. So to install the LED in the reflector, there is a very tight tolerance, a very snug fit. So what works for me is to line the LED up with the hole. Use a piece of pliers, not to grip the LED, but basically just to push flat against the back of the LED. And then that way I can apply some force, like so, to force the LED snugly into the light housing. And that's not coming out. And we very carefully take our 1x5mm Phillips head screw, drop it into the eyelet on the light, and drop it into the wheel well. Place it in the eyelet and drop it again.
2 hours later.
We take our 1x5mm Phillips head screw with our thumb, jam it into the eyelet on the light, start it with the Phillips screwdriver, and then we just snug that in. We're just going to kind of run these wires down alongside the strut, and then I'll secure them to the strut with some good old-fashioned wrapping tape. They need to be on the side of the strut or the back of the strut, but not on the front, because it interferes with the proper operation of the retract mechanism. And to make sure that the wires don't get tangled up, we're going to secure them to the sides of the wheel well area so that they stay out of the way of the retracts. And we're just going to simply secure those with some more tape. So like so. And we're going to do the same thing with the red wire on the other side. And out of the way. The main landing gear is a little bit more involved, but it's not terrible. First thing we need to do is remove the wheel well cover off of the wheel strut. It's held on by 2 Phillips screws, and it's important that this go back on because this will be used to help keep the wires in check. And when we're feeding the wires back on, the wires will pass between the screws and the strut to help keep the wires from moving around where they don't need to move around. Our light needs to mount to the outside of the strut. So this strut mount, unlike the nose wheel strut mount, has the mount for the light itself on the side. And so that side is going to go to the side of the strut where we need the wheel to go. So it just kind of goes around the strut itself, kind of snaps in place, and then spins around. And it's going to clamp, and we're going to clamp it to the strut flush with the top of the widest part of the strut, so about right there. And then we grab our 3x5mm cap screw, and we get to sinking that guy in there. There we go, and just kind of position it around where we want it to be. That, and then we tighten it the rest of the way. So now we grab our last 1x5mm Phillips head screw on the strut mount, and then just tighten that down. Position it where we need it to be, which is about right there. And then these wires, and above the light, the wheel need to go around behind the strut. We take our wheel well door and reattach it. And then this bit of wire here, we're just going to push it down into the back of the wheel well. Take up the little bit of slack that's there. Like so. And now that all the lights are installed, it's time to do a motion check to make sure that the wheel wells that there's no blockage in the wheel wells or anything like that that prevents the operation. So we have our radio installed. We flip our retract switch and see what happens. Okay, it looks like this is blocked a little bit. So we Bring it back out. Right around this area where there's an indentation in the foam, it's just kind of getting in the way a little bit. So it just kind of can reach into there, a little cut, and it goes without saying, if you're going to be cutting foam, use a brand new blade to get a nice clean cut. So let's try it again. Looks like we're almost there. Just a little bit more to cut. There we go. And I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone, but there are no issues with the nose wheel well. Well, it looks like since everything checks out mechanically, only thing left to do is flip it over, connect all this to the receiver, program it, and test it.
This is the wire from the landing lights, all soldered in, insulated, and ready to go. We're simply going to plug it into channel 9 on the receiver, like so. And now that we've gotten everything connected, we can take a few moments to convert this entire chaos of wires and connectors into something more organized, airworthy, and that I can be proud of.
Now that our model is set up, our landing lights are plugged in to channel 9 and installed on the landing struts. The last thing to do is a little bit of programming to tell the controller that the lights are there. So we go into our model setup. We start with our mixer. We scroll down to channel 9 in our mixer, and we're going to add a full source channel. I'm going to scroll down, and we're going to assign that channel to the gear switch. There. And then we're going to jump down to our delay up. We're going to set that to 2 seconds. And that gives a little bit of time for the lights to come on after the gear comes down. And that's it in that window. Now, the last thing I do in programming is I'll go to safety switch, and I'm going to program it so that I use my landing lights as an indicator as to whether or not the model is armed or not. So I'm going to jump down to channel 9 in my safety switches. Channel 9 is the channel that the landing lights are plugged into. And I'm simply going to tell it that on that channel, assign it to the throttle switch. Then we're going to exit out of that, exit out of that. And the last thing to do is...
Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please hit the like button. If you want to see more content, add it in the comments. And of course, don't forget to click the subscribe button.